The Hartley's department store bustled with pre-Christmas shoppers, but manager Frank Thompson's mind was far from the holiday spirit. His eyes darted from customer to customer, searching for any sign of suspicious activity. The recent string of thefts had set him on edge, and today marked 5 years since he'd lost his son. The weight of grief and anger pressed down on him like a physical force. A movement near the jewelry counter caught Frank's attention. He watched as a young employee slipped something into his pocket. Without hesitation, Frank stormed over, his face flushed with rage. "Empty your pockets now," he barked, causing nearby customers to turn and stare. The employee, trembling, pulled out a small box. "I was just moving it to a better display spot," he stammered. Frank snatched the box, his knuckles white. "You're fired. Get out before I call the cops." As the shaken employee hurried away, Frank felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see George Hartley, the store owner, looking concerned. "Frank, a word in my office, please," George said quietly. Once inside, George sighed. "Frank, I understand you're under stress, but we can't keep losing staff like this. The holiday rush is upon us, and we need to hire more people, not fire them." Frank clenched his jaw. "With all due respect, sir, we can't afford to be soft on potential thieves." George's expression softened. "I know what day it is, Frank. I remember Michael too. But we need to move forward. I want you to hire some temporary staff, including a few from our Second Chance program." Frank's eyes widened. "You can't be serious? Ex-cons in our store?" "I am serious," George replied firmly. "Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Make it happen, Frank." As George left, Frank slumped in his chair, memories of his son flooding back. Michael's laugh, his dreams, all snuffed out by a senseless act of violence. And now he was expected to welcome criminals into the store. The very thought made his blood boil. Later that afternoon, Frank sat across from Jason Wright, the last interviewee of the day. The young man's nervous energy was palpable as he fidgeted in his seat. "So, Mr. Wright, tell me about your last job," Frank said, his tone clipped. Jason swallowed hard. "Well, sir, to be honest, my last job was in the prison laundry. I've just been released after serving 3 years for theft." Frank's jaw tightened. "And why should I hire an ex-con to work in a store full of valuable merchandise?" Jason leaned forward, his eyes earnest. "Because I've learned my lesson, sir. I want to turn my life around. I'll work harder than anyone else here, I promise." Frank studied Jason, noting the desperation in his eyes. Part of him wanted to throw the young man out, but George's words echoed in his mind. With a heavy sigh, he made his decision. "Fine, you start tomorrow, but listen closely." Frank leaned in, his voice low and threatening. "I'll be watching you like a hawk. One slip up, one hint of trouble, and you'll be back behind bars so fast your head will spin. Understood?" Jason nodded vigorously, relief washing over his face. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. You won't regret this." As Jason left, Frank felt a knot in his stomach. He glanced at the photo of Michael on his desk, guilt mingling with his grief. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." The next morning, Frank watched as Jason entered the store, his new employee badge pinned to his shirt. The young man's eyes were wide, taking in the holiday decorations and bustling atmosphere. For a moment, Frank saw a glimmer of hope in Jason's expression, and it stirred something long buried in his heart. But he quickly squashed the feeling, reminding himself of the harsh realities of the world. "Right," he called out sharply. "Get to work. Those shelves won't stock themselves." As Jason hurried off, Frank turned away, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. He had a store to run and a legacy to protect. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. Jason's first week at Hartley's was far from easy. As he stocked shelves and assisted customers, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His coworkers' whispers and sideways glances made it clear they knew about his past. During his lunch break, Jason sat alone in the break room, picking at his sandwich. 2 other employees entered, their conversation halting abruptly when they saw him. "Well, if it isn't the jailbird," one of them sneered. "Better watch our wallets around him, right?" Jason kept his head down, his appetite gone. He'd expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. As he stood to leave, he bumped into Sarah, a cashier he'd seen around the store. "Don't let them get to you," she said quietly. "They're just scared of what they don't understand." Jason nodded, grateful for the small kindness. Thanks, I'm trying. As the days went on, Jason threw himself into his work, determined to prove himself. He stayed late to organize messy displays and volunteered for the tasks no one else wanted. But no matter how hard he tried, Frank's suspicious gaze followed him everywhere. One afternoon, as Jason was restocking in the electronics department, he overheard a heated conversation between Frank and George. Another laptop gone missing. Frank growled, "That's 3 this week. We need to do something drastic." "Let's not jump to conclusions," George replied. "It could be anyone." "Or it could be our new special hire," Frank retorted. "I told you this was a mistake." Jason's heart sank. He knew he was innocent, but how could he prove it? Later that day, Sarah approached Jason as he was cleaning up a spill in the shoe department. "Hey," she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I just wanted to say, I believe in second chances. If you ever need someone to talk to." Jason managed a small smile. "Thanks, Sarah, that means a lot." As closing time approached, Frank called all the employees together. His face was grim as he addressed the group. "As some of you may have heard, we've had several thefts recently. I want everyone to know that we're taking this very seriously. If anyone has any information, come forward now. Otherwise, we'll be implementing stricter security measures." His eyes lingered on Jason as he spoke, making it clear who he suspected. That night, as Jason lay in his small apartment, memories of his past flooded back. He remembered the night that changed everything, the desperation, the foolish decision to break into a house, the sound of sirens. He'd promised himself he'd never go down that road again, but now it felt like the whole world was pushing him back towards it. The next morning, Jason arrived early, hoping to avoid his coworkers. As he entered the store, he noticed something new. Small, discreet cameras had been installed overnight, their lenses pointing at strategic locations throughout the store. Frank stepped out of his office, a satisfied look on his face when he saw Jason noticing the cameras. "Just a little extra security," he said, his tone cold. "I'm sure you understand." Jason nodded, his throat tight. He knew most of those cameras would be trained on him. As he started his shift, Jason felt the weight of constant surveillance. Every move he made, every customer he helped, was now being recorded and scrutinized. The pressure was overwhelming. During his break, he found a quiet corner and pulled out his phone. His finger hovered over his sister's number. One call, and he could give up, go back home, find some other way to make ends meet. But then he thought of the promise he'd made to himself, to his family, to do better. With a deep breath, he put the phone away and stood up. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it right, no matter what anyone thought of him. As Jason walked back onto the sales floor, he saw Sarah at her register. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it was enough to keep him going. Frank watched from his office, his eyes narrow as he observed Jason on the security monitors. He'd catch him eventually, he was sure of it. It was only a matter of time. As weeks passed at Hartley's, the tension remained high. One evening, Sarah was staying late to catch up on paperwork when she heard a noise from the break room. Curious, she peeked in and saw Jason hunched over a book, scribbling notes. "Jason?" she called softly. He jumped, slamming the book shut. "What are you doing here so late?" Jason hesitated, then sighed. "I'm studying for my GED. I figured no one would bother me here after hours." Sarah's expression softened. "That's great, Jason. Good for you." From that moment, a quiet friendship began to form between them. Sarah would cover for Jason when he needed extra study time, and he'd help her with heavy lifting or difficult customers. One day, as they were having lunch together, Sarah noticed Jason's dejected expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. Jason shook his head. "Frank cornered me this morning. A watch went missing from the jewelry counter. He practically accused me of taking it." Sarah frowned. "That's not fair. You've been working so hard." "It doesn't matter," Jason replied. "No one sees that. They only see my past." Later that afternoon, Jason was restocking shelves when he noticed an elderly man struggling with a heavy box. Without hesitation, he rushed over to help. "Thank you, young man," the old man wheezed. "My grandson's birthday present. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Jason smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Happy to help, sir. Let me carry that out to your car for you." As they walked to the parking lot, Frank watched from his office window, his brow furrowed in confusion. That night, Frank tossed and turned in his bed. In his dreams, he saw his son Michael, smiling and laughing. Suddenly, Michael's face morphed into Jason's, and he was being led away in handcuffs. Frank woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The next day, Sarah found Jason in the break room, looking troubled. "Everything okay?" she asked. Jason hesitated, then spoke. "I saw the way that old man looked at me yesterday, like I was a good person. It's been so long since anyone looked at me like that." Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "You are a good person, Jason. You've just made mistakes, like we all have." Jason looked at her, surprised by her kindness. "Why are you so nice to me? Everyone else here treats me like I'm going to rob them blind." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I guess I understand what it's like to be judged unfairly." She took a deep breath. "My ex-husband was a gambling addict. He nearly ruined us. When people found out, they looked at me differently, like I was somehow to blame." Jason nodded, feeling a connection with Sarah he hadn't expected. "I'm sorry you went through that." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion on the sales floor. They rushed out to find a middle-aged woman pointing accusingly at Jason. "It was him," she shrieked. "He stole my wallet. I saw him near my purse earlier." Frank appeared, his face a mask of anger. "Right, my office now." As Jason followed Frank, he caught Sarah's eye. She looked worried, but gave him a small nod of encouragement. In Frank's office, the accusations flew. "I knew it was only a matter of time," Frank growled. "Where's the wallet?" "I didn't take anything," Jason protested. "I swear." Their argument was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Sarah, holding a wallet. "Excuse me," she said, "but I think I found what you're looking for. It was under a stack of sweaters in the women's department." The woman snatched her wallet, looking embarrassed. "Oh, well, I suppose I was mistaken." As the woman left, Frank turned to Jason. "You got lucky this time, but don't think for a second that I trust you." Jason nodded silently and left the office. Outside, Sarah was waiting. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Jason replied. "Thanks for having my back in there." Sarah smiled. "That's what friends are for, right?" As they walked back to work, Jason felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could make this second chance work. But unknown to them, Frank watched from his office, his suspicion growing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, and he was determined to find out what it was. The bell above Hartley's front door chimed, and all eyes turned to see George Hartley himself walk in. Frank, who had been berating a junior employee, straightened up immediately. "George," he said, forcing a smile. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you today." George waved him off. "Just thought I'd drop by, see how things are running." His eyes scanned the store, taking in every detail. As George made his rounds, Frank hovered nervously nearby. They approached the electronics section, where Jason was helping a customer with a laptop. "And how long is the warranty on this model?" the customer was asking. "It comes with a standard 1-year warranty," Jason replied confidently. "But I'd recommend the extended 3-year plan. It covers accidental damage, which can be a lifesaver." The customer nodded, impressed. "I'll take it, with the extended warranty." George clapped Jason on the shoulder. "Excellent work, young man. That's the kind of initiative we like to see." Jason beamed, while Frank's face darkened. "Thank you, sir," Jason said. "I'm just trying my best." As they moved on, Frank muttered, "Don't let it go to your head, right?" George continued his inspection, praising staff members and making suggestions. Frank trailed behind, growing increasingly agitated. Every compliment George gave felt like a personal slight. Suddenly, a shout came from the jewelry counter. "The diamond necklace is gone!" Frank's head snapped around. "What?" The saleswoman was frantic. "It was here a minute ago. I swear!" George frowned. "Frank, what's going on here?" Before Frank could respond, he spotted Jason nearby. "You," he growled, storming over. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Jason protested, backing away. "Frank," George's voice was sharp. "That's enough. We don't make accusations without proof." Frank turned to George, his face red. "But sir," with his history. "I said enough," George interrupted. "We'll review the security footage. Until then, everyone goes back to work." As the crowd dispersed, Jason caught Sarah's eye. She gave him a sympathetic look before returning to her register. Later in the stockroom, Jason found himself alone. he noticed a box of expensive watches carelessly left open. For a moment, he hesitated. It would be so easy to slip one into his pocket. No one would know. The temptation was overwhelming. His hand reached out, almost of its own accord. But then he stopped, remembering Sarah's kindness, the trust George had shown. With a deep breath, he closed the box and walked away. Meanwhile, Frank was in his office reviewing security footage with George. "There has to be something," Frank muttered, fast-forwarding through hours of video. George wiped his brow, looking unusually nervous. "Maybe we should call it a day, Frank. We can continue this tomorrow." Frank glanced at George, noticing his agitation. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" Fine, George said quickly. "Just tired. It's been a long day." As they left the office, Frank saw Jason emerging from the stockroom. His eyes narrowed. "Right! What are you doing back there?" Jason held up a clipboard. "Inventory count, sir, like you asked." Frank grunted, unconvinced. "Get out of here. We're closing up." As Jason left, Frank turned to George. "I don't trust him, sir. He's up to something, I know it." George sighed. "Frank, your suspicion is clouding your judgment. Jason has been an exemplary employee. Perhaps it's time to let go of your prejudices." Frank watched George leave, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. Something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. After everyone had gone, Frank did one last sweep of the store. As he passed the stockroom, he heard a noise inside. Quietly, he opened the door. There was Jason, alone in the dim light of the stockroom. Frank's heart raced. Had he finally caught the thief in the act? "Right," he barked. "What are you doing here?" Jason spun around, startled. "Mr. Thompson, I can explain." Frank crossed his arms. "Oh, I'm sure you can, and you'd better make it good." As Jason stammered to find words, Frank felt a grim satisfaction. He'd been right all along. Now, he just needed to hear the confession. Frank glared at Jason in the dim light of the stockroom. "I knew it. I knew you couldn't be trusted. What are you stealing this time, right?" Jason's eyes widened. "No, sir, I'm not stealing anything. I was just—" "Save it!" Frank shouted, his face reddening. "I've had enough of your lies. You're nothing but a criminal, and you always will be." Jason backed away, his hands raised. "Please, Mr. Thompson, let me explain. I'm not doing anything wrong." Frank advanced on Jason, his voice rising. "You think you fooled everyone with your act? The polite ex-con trying to turn his life around? I see right through you, right? You're just waiting for your chance to rob us blind." "That's not true," Jason protested, his back now against the wall. "I'm trying to change. I'm working hard, studying for my GED. I haven't done anything wrong." Frank grabbed Jason's shirt, pushing him against the shelves. "Stop lying. I know you're behind the thefts. Admit it." In a moment of panic, Jason pushed Frank away. Frank, caught off guard, stumbled backward and fell, hitting his head on a low shelf. Jason stood frozen, horrified at what had just happened. Frank groaned, touching the back of his head. When he pulled his hand away, there was a small smear of rough blood. Frank's eyes blazed with fury as he struggled to his feet. "That's it, right? You're done. I'm calling the police right now. Assault on top of theft. You'll be back behind bars before morning." "No, please," Jason begged, his voice breaking. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "Shut up," Frank roared, reaching for his phone. Suddenly, the stockroom door burst open. Sarah stood there, her eyes wide with shock. "What's going on here? I heard shouting." Frank pointed at Jason. "This thief just assaulted me. Call the police, Sarah." "Wait," Sarah exclaimed. "I saw everything. Jason didn't assault you, Frank. You were the one who grabbed him first." Frank's face paled. "What are you talking about? You weren't even here." Sarah held up her phone. "I came back because I forgot my purse. I heard the commotion and started recording. You were threatening Jason. He only pushed you in self-defense." Frank's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Jason looked at Sarah gratefully, hardly daring to believe what was happening. "Jason," Sarah said gently, "why don't you tell us why you were really here?" Jason took a deep breath. "I was organizing donations for the children's shelter downtown. Mr. Hartley gave me permission to collect items that weren't selling well. I was going to deliver them tomorrow morning before my shift." Frank's anger deflated, replaced by confusion and a growing sense of shame. He looked at the boxes Jason had been organizing, filled with toys and warm clothes. Sarah turned to Frank, her voice firm. "Frank, this has gone too far. Your treatment of Jason has been unfair from the start. If you don't give him a real chance, I'll have no choice but to report your behavior to Mr. Hartley and the corporate office. Frank's shoulders sagged. The fight seemed to drain out of him. I need some time to think. As Frank left the stockroom, Jason turned to Sarah. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I thought it was all over." Sarah smiled. "You're welcome. But Jason, why didn't you tell anyone about the donations?" Jason shrugged. "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. And honestly, I didn't think anyone would believe me." Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. "Well, I believe in you. And after this, I think others will too." As they left the stockroom, Jason felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had avoided disaster tonight, but what would tomorrow bring? Would Frank finally give him a real chance, or would this incident only make things worse? Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't worry," she said. "I meant what I said to Frank. I won't let him treat you unfairly anymore." Jason nodded, grateful for her support. As they walked out of the store, he realized that for the first time since starting at Hartley's, he felt a glimmer of hope for his future there. But as Sarah drove away and Jason started his walk home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of his troubles. Frank's suspicion and anger ran deep, and Jason knew that changing his mind wouldn't be easy. Tomorrow would be a new challenge, and he would have to be ready for whatever came his way. The morning after the confrontation in the stockroom, Jason arrived at Hartley's feeling uneasy. As he walked in, he noticed Frank watching him from the office, his expression unreadable. Halfway through his shift, 2 police officers entered the store. They approached Frank, who pointed directly at Jason. The officers made their way to where Jason was restocking shelves. "Jason Wright?" one officer asked. Jason nodded, his heart racing. "Yes, that's me. We need you to come with us for questioning regarding a robbery that occurred last night at the convenience store down the street." Jason's eyes widened. "What? I didn't rob any store." By now, customers and employees were staring. Frank approached, looking grim. "What's going on here?" The officer explained. "A witness identified Mr. Wright as the person seen fleeing the scene of a robbery last night." Frank's eyebrows shot up. "I knew it. I knew he couldn't be trusted." "This is a mistake," Jason protested. "I was home all night after my shift." Despite his pleas, the officers led Jason out of the store in handcuffs. Whispers and stares followed him as he was escorted to the police car. At the station, Jason was interrogated for hours. He maintained his innocence, but the detective seemed unconvinced. "You have a record, Mr. Wright, and a witness placed you at the scene. How do you explain that?" Jason slumped in his chair, feeling defeated. "I can't explain it, but I'm telling you, I didn't do this." Back at Hartley's, Sarah was troubled by the arrest. Something didn't add up. During her lunch break, she decided to visit the convenience store that had been robbed. The store owner, Mr. Patel, was cleaning up the mess left by the robbery. Sarah introduced herself and asked about the incident. "It was terrible," Mr. Patel said. "He took all the money from the register and some expensive items, but the strange thing is he knew exactly where the safe was hidden." Sarah's brow furrowed. "That is strange. Did you get a good look at him?" Mr. Patel shook his head. "No, he wore a mask, but Mrs. Johnson from across the street said she saw him running away." Sarah thanked Mr. Patel and left, her mind racing. She decided to pay Mrs. Johnson a visit. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman, seemed eager to talk about the robbery. "Oh yes, I saw him clear as day. Tall, thin young man. Looked just like that ex-con working at Hartley's." Sarah pressed further. "Mrs. Johnson, how do you know about the employee at Hartley's?" The old woman hesitated. "Well, George Hartley is my nephew. He mentioned hiring an ex-convict recently. Said it was causing some trouble with his manager." Sarah's eyes widened at this revelation. She thanked Mrs. Johnson and left, her suspicions growing. Meanwhile, Jason was released from custody due to lack of evidence, but the damage was done. When he returned to Hartley's, everyone treated him like a criminal again. Even Sarah's supportive glances couldn't lift his spirits. During his break, Jason sat alone in the stockroom, his head in his hands. He'd tried so hard to turn his life around, and now it was all falling apart. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe he'd never escape his past. Frank, watching from his office, felt a twinge of doubt. He'd been so sure of Jason's guilt, but now he wasn't certain. The look of despair on Jason's face didn't match the hardened criminal Frank had imagined him to be. As closing time approached, Sarah pulled Jason aside. "I don't think you did it," she whispered. "Something's not right about this whole situation. I'm going to figure it out." Jason gave her a weak smile. "Thanks, Sarah. But maybe it's time I face reality. No one's ever going to see me as anything but a criminal." Sarah squeezed his arm. "Don't give up. We'll get to the bottom of this." Just as they were about to close, George Hartley burst into the store looking panicked. "Frank, we need to do an emergency inventory check. Now!" Frank frowned. "What's going on, George?" George's eyes darted around nervously. "Just do it. Check the high-value items first." As Frank and George disappeared into the office, Sarah and Jason exchanged worried glances. What new crisis was unfolding? An hour later, Frank emerged, his face ashen. He addressed the remaining staff, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know how to say this, but we've been robbed. A massive theft. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise is missing." The employees gasped in shock. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. Jason felt the weight of everyone's stares on him once again. Frank continued, "We'll be closed tomorrow while the police investigate. For now, go home. And Merry Christmas Eve, I guess." As the stunned employees filed out, Sarah caught Jason's eye. They both knew that tomorrow would bring a storm unlike anything they'd faced before. The question was, would they weather it together, or would this be the final blow to Jason's chance at redemption? Christmas Eve morning dawned cold and gray at Hartley's. Despite the store being closed, employees gathered in the break room, waiting for news about the theft. The tension was palpable as Frank entered, followed by 2 police officers. Frank cleared his throat. "As you know, we've suffered a major theft. The police are here to investigate, and they'll need to question all of us." His eyes landed on Jason. "Right, they'll start with you." Jason stood, his face pale. "Mr. Thompson, I swear I didn't." "Save it for the police," Frank snapped. As Jason was led away, Sarah approached Frank. "This isn't right. Jason's innocent." Frank ignored her, addressing the room. "While the police do their job, I want everyone to cooperate fully. We need to get to the bottom of this." Hours passed as each employee was questioned. Outside, snow began to fall heavily. By afternoon, a full-blown blizzard was raging. Finally, the lead detective emerged from the office with Jason. The detective spoke quietly to Frank, who nodded grimly. Frank faced the anxious employees. "The police have finished their initial investigation. Based on the evidence and Jason Wright's history, they believe he is the prime suspect in this theft." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Jason's face crumpled in disbelief. "That's impossible," Sarah shouted. Frank held up his hand. "Wright will be taken into custody pending further investigation." Jason, his voice breaking, pleaded, "Please, you have to believe me. I didn't do this." Frank's face hardened. "Enough. I gave you a chance, and this is how you repay us? By stealing thousands of dollars worth of merchandise?" "But I didn't," Jason started. "Get out," Frank roared. "You're fired, and I hope they lock you up for good this time." Humiliated and desperate, Jason bolted from the room. He ran through the store and out into the howling storm, ignoring the shouts behind him. Sarah, furious, confronted Frank. "How could you do that? You have no proof." Frank turned on her. "No proof? His history is proof enough. Who else could have pulled this off?" Sarah pulled out her phone. "I've been doing some digging. There's something you need to see." She showed Frank a series of photos and documents. These bank records show large deposits into an offshore account linked to someone in upper management. And look at this security footage from last night. Frank squinted at the blurry image. "That could be anyone." "Exactly," Sarah said. "It's not clear enough to identify Jason, but it's definitely not him. The build is all wrong." Frank's certainty wavered. "But if not Jason, then who?" Sarah lowered her voice. "I think it might be George Hartley." Frank staggered back. "George? That's impossible. He owns the store." "Think about it," Sarah pressed. "The thief knew exactly where everything valuable was kept. And remember how nervous George was during his last visit?" Frank's mind raced, remembering George's odd behavior. Could it be true? Suddenly, the power flickered and went out. In the dim emergency lighting, Frank realized the gravity of what he'd done. "Oh God," he whispered. "Jason's out there in this storm." Sarah's eyes widened. "We have to find him." Frank nodded, grabbing his coat. "I'll go. I'm the one who drove him to this." "You can't go alone," Sarah argued. "It's too dangerous." I have to, Frank insisted. This is my fault. I let my prejudice blind me. I have to make this right. As Frank prepared to leave, the other employees volunteered to help search. Teams were quickly organized, armed with flashlights and warm clothes. Frank turned to Sarah. Stay here. Keep trying to reach Jason on his phone, and keep digging into what you found about George. If you're right, we need to know everything. Sarah nodded, determination in her eyes. Be careful out there. Frank stepped out into the raging blizzard, the wind nearly knocking him over. As he fought against the storm, memories of his son Michael flooded his mind. He'd failed Michael, unable to protect him. Now he'd failed Jason too, letting his grief and anger cloud his judgment. I'm sorry, Michael, Frank whispered into the wind. I'm sorry, Jason. Please let me find him. As Frank disappeared into the whiteout conditions, Sarah watched from the window, worry etched on her face. She turned back to her phone, scrolling through more financial records. There had to be something here to prove Jason's innocence and reveal the true culprit. In the storm, Frank trudged on, calling Jason's name. The bitter cold bit into his skin, but he pressed forward. He had to find Jason. He had to make this right. As the snow swirled around him, Frank realized that this storm might just cost him everything. But if it meant saving Jason and finally confronting his own demons, it would be worth it. Frank trudged through the snow, the wind howling around him. Visibility was near zero, and the cold seeped through his clothes. Jason, he shouted, his voice swallowed by the storm. As he pushed on, memories of Michael flooded his mind. The day he taught him to ride a bike, his high school graduation, the last time he saw him alive. Frank's chest tightened. Had he been so consumed by grief that he'd become the very thing he hated? Someone who judged others unfairly? Meanwhile, at Hartley's, Sarah pored over security footage. She gasped as she spotted something. In several clips, Jason was shown helping elderly customers, fixing displays after hours, even putting money from his own wallet into the charity collection box. Her phone rang. It was George Hartley. Sarah, I heard you've been asking questions, George said, his voice tense. We need to talk. Back in the storm, Frank stumbled upon a huddled figure in the snow. Jason. He rushed over, brushing snow off the young man's face. Jason's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Mr. Thompson, he mumbled. I'm here, son. I'm going to get you out of here, Frank said, helping Jason to his feet. As they struggled through the blizzard, Jason, delirious from the cold, began to ramble. I'm sorry. I tried to be good, just wanted a chance. Frank felt a lump in his throat. You have nothing to be sorry for, Jason. I'm the one who should apologize. At Hartley's, George paced in front of Sarah. You don't understand. I had no choice. The gambling debts, they were going to hurt my family. Sarah's eyes widened. So you did steal from the store. George nodded, deflating. It started small, but it grew. I couldn't stop. Please, Sarah, if this gets out, everything will be ruined. In the storm, Frank and Jason sought shelter in an abandoned shed. As Frank tried to warm Jason up, the young man continued to talk. I had dreams, you know, Jason said, his teeth chattering. Wanted to make my mom proud, open my own business someday, help kids like me. Frank felt tears freezing on his cheeks. You can still do all that, Jason. I'm gonna make this right. As Jason drifted in and out of consciousness, Frank confronted his own biases. He'd been so quick to judge, so unwilling to see the good in Jason, all because of his own unresolved grief. The shed door burst open. It was a rescue team. We found them, one shouted into a radio. At the hospital, Frank paced outside Jason's room. Sarah arrived, her face grim. Frank, I have proof. It was George all along. He confessed to me. Frank's world spun. George? But why? Sarah explained about the gambling debts and George's desperation. A doctor emerged from Jason's room. He's stable. Hypothermia and some frostbite, but he'll recover. Frank nodded, relief washing over him. But now, a new weight settled on his shoulders. What should he do with the truth about George? If he revealed it, the store would likely close. Dozens would lose their jobs right after Christmas. But if he stayed silent, was he any better than those who had judged Jason unfairly? Sarah watched Frank's internal struggle. What are you going to do? Frank took a deep breath. I don't know, Sarah. But whatever I decide, I need to talk to Jason first. I owe him that much. As Frank entered Jason's room, he saw the young man lying there, looking small and vulnerable. The machines beeped steadily, a reminder of how close they'd come to tragedy. Jason stirred, his eyes focusing on Frank. "Mr. Thompson, what happened?" Frank sat by the bed, his voice heavy with emotion. "We've got a lot to talk about, Jason, and I'm going to start by saying I'm sorry. I was wrong about you, so wrong." As Jason listened, confusion and hope warring on his face, Frank began to explain everything: the rescue, the revelations about George, and his own journey to confront his prejudices. Outside the room, Sarah watched through the window, her own thoughts turbulent. She knew that whatever decision Frank made about George would have far-reaching consequences for all of them. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white. But inside the hospital room, years of misunderstanding and pain were finally beginning to thaw. Frank sat in the hospital waiting room, his head in his hands. The rhythmic beeping of machines from nearby rooms seemed to echo his racing thoughts. Jason's condition had worsened overnight, and doctors were now fighting to save him from severe hypothermia. Sarah approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Frank. "Any news?" Frank shook his head. "They're still working on him. It's touch and go." As they sat in silence, Frank's mind wandered to the day after Michael's funeral. George had shown up at his house, offering not just condolences, but a job at Hartley's. "You need purpose, Frank," George had said. "Let me help you find it." Now, knowing what George had done, Frank felt torn. How could he betray the man who had given him a lifeline in his darkest hour? Sarah interrupted his thoughts. "Frank, we need to talk about George. What are you going to do?" Frank sighed. "I don't know, Sarah. It's not that simple." "It is that simple," Sarah insisted. "He's a thief. He nearly destroyed Jason's life. We have to turn him in." "And what about the store?" Frank countered. "If this gets out, Hartley's will close. Dozens of people will lose their jobs, right after Christmas, no less." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "So we protect a criminal to save a store? What about justice for Jason?" Before Frank could respond, a doctor approached. "Mr. Thompson, Jason is stable for now, but he's not out of the woods. The next 24 hours will be critical." As the doctor left, Frank stood up. "I need some air." He walked to Jason's room, looking through the window at the young man's still form. Machines beeped and whirred, keeping him alive. Frank saw not just Jason, but a reflection of his own son. Both young men with dreams, both victims of circumstances beyond their control. A nurse exited Jason's room, holding a plastic bag. "Mr. Thompson, we found this in Jason's pocket. I thought you might want to hold on to it." Frank took the bag, finding Jason's wallet inside. As he opened it, a folded piece of paper fell out. It was a bank receipt. Frank's eyes widened as he read it. It was a transfer to Valencia Community College, with a memo: "Tuition for Amy Wright." "Who's Amy Wright?" Frank wondered aloud. "That's Jason's younger sister," Sarah said, appearing beside him. "He mentioned her once, said he was helping her go to college." Frank felt a lump in his throat. All this time, Jason had been using his meager salary not for himself, but to help his sister get an education. Sarah placed a hand on Frank's arm. "I know George helped you after Michael died. But Frank, you have to see that keeping quiet about this isn't helping anyone. Not really." Frank nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been blind for too long. It's time to face the truth, no matter how painful." Just then, Frank's phone buzzed. It was a text from George. "Heard about Jason. Coming to the hospital now. We need to talk." Frank showed the message to Sarah. "Looks like decision time has come early." Sarah squeezed his arm. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But remember, if you don't tell the truth, I will. We owe it to Jason." Frank took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "No, this is my responsibility. I'll handle George." As they waited for George to arrive, Frank looked once more at Jason through the window. In that moment, he saw not just a young man fighting for his life, but a symbol of the second chance he'd been too blind to see before. "I'm sorry, Michael," Frank whispered. "I let my grief turn me into someone you wouldn't have been proud of. But I'm going to make it right. For you, for Jason, for everyone." The elevator dinged, and George stepped out, looking haggard and nervous. His eyes met Frank's, and in that moment, both men knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Frank straightened up, his decision made. It was time to face the truth, no matter the cost. As George approached, Frank steeled himself for the confrontation that would change all their lives forever. Frank stood in the center of Hartley's, surrounded by employees and a few regular customers who had come to help with post-holiday inventory. George Hartley stood beside him, oblivious to what was about to unfold. "Everyone, I have an important announcement," Frank began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've discovered some disturbing information about the recent thefts." George's head snapped towards Frank, panic flickering in his eyes. "Frank, what are you doing?" Ignoring him, Frank continued, "The person responsible for stealing from Hartley's is standing right here." He turned to face George. "Isn't that right, George?" A collective gasp echoed through the store. George's face paled. "Frank, you don't know what you're talking about. Let's discuss this in private." "No more secrets," Frank said firmly. "You've been embezzling money and merchandise for months, maybe years. You framed Jason Wright to cover your tracks." George's composure cracked. "You don't understand. I had no choice." As murmurs of shock and disbelief spread through the crowd, George suddenly bolted towards the exit. In his haste, he knocked over a large display, sending merchandise crashing to the floor. "Stop him!" Frank shouted. Two employees moved to block the door, but George changed direction, heading for the back of the store. In his panic, he collided with a shelf, causing a domino effect of falling displays. Amidst the chaos, someone called the police. Within minutes, sirens could be heard approaching. Frank found George huddled in the stockroom, his head in his hands. "It's over, George. The police are here." George looked up, his eyes red. "I never meant for it to go this far, Frank. The gambling, it started after my wife died. I just wanted to feel something, anything." Frank felt a pang of sympathy, remembering his own grief after losing Michael. But he steeled himself. "That doesn't excuse what you did to Jason or to this store." As the police led George away in handcuffs, the employees gathered around Frank, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and confusion. "What's going to happen to the store?" someone asked. "Is it true about Jason? He was innocent all along?" Another chimed in. Frank held up his hands. "I know you all have questions. I promise we'll address everything. But right now, we need to cooperate with the police investigation." As the day wore on, the full extent of George's crimes came to light. The community, initially in disbelief, rallied around the store employees. Local news crews arrived, interviewing shocked customers and staff. Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he told the truth, but guilt nagged at him. How had he been so blind for so long? Sarah approached him, her face grim. "Frank, I've been looking at the books. With what George stole, plus the legal fees we're facing, Hartley's might not survive this." Frank nodded, the reality sinking in. "Call a staff meeting for tomorrow morning. They deserve to know the truth, and we need to discuss our options." That night, as Frank locked up the store, he paused to look at the Hartley's sign glowing above the entrance. The place that had been his refuge after Michael's death now stood on the brink of collapse. His phone buzzed, a text from the hospital. "Jason awake, asking for you." A mix of relief and anxiety washed over Frank. Jason was alive, but what would he say when he learned the truth? As Frank drove to the hospital, his mind raced. The store might be lost, but perhaps something more valuable had been gained. Trust, truth, a chance for real redemption, not just for Jason, but for Frank himself. He arrived at Jason's room, taking a deep breath before entering. It was time to face the young man he had wronged, and to start making things right. The morning after George's arrest, Hartley's employees gathered in the break room. Frank stood before them, his face etched with concern. "I won't sugarcoat it," he began. "The store is in serious trouble. We're facing potential bankruptcy." A murmur of distress rippled through the crowd. Sarah stepped forward. "But we have an idea. What if we turned Hartley's into a worker-owned cooperative?" Frank nodded. "It's a long shot, but it might be our only chance to save the store and our jobs." The employees looked at each other, a mix of hope and uncertainty in their eyes. "How would it work?" someone asked. As Frank and Sarah explained the concept, a spark of excitement began to grow. By the end of the meeting, the staff had unanimously agreed to try. Word spread quickly through the small town. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Hartley's plight and the employees' bold plan. Soon, community members were showing up at the store, offering support and resources. A local lawyer volunteered to help with the legal paperwork. A retired accountant offered to review the finances. Even competitors reached out, recognizing that Hartley's closure would hurt the entire business district. Meanwhile, Jason was recovering in the hospital. Frank visited him daily, updating him on the store's transformation. At first, Jason was hesitant, unsure of his place in this new Hartley's, but as Frank shared stories of the community's response, Jason felt a growing desire to be part of it. "I want to help," Jason said one day. "When I get out of here, I want to come back to work." Frank smiled. "We'll be glad to have you. In fact, I have an idea I want to run by you." 2 weeks later, Jason attended his first staff meeting as a co-owner of Hartley's Cooperative. Frank stood at the front of the room, a large whiteboard behind him. "Today, we're going to discuss a new initiative," Frank announced. "Jason and I have been talking about starting a second chance program, offering jobs and mentorship to people rebuilding their lives after incarceration." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, people began to nod and voice their support. Jason's story had opened their eyes to the power of redemption. As winter turned to spring, Hartley's Cooperative flourished. The Second Chance program brought in new employees, each with their own story of struggle and hope. The store became known not just for its products, but for its commitment to the community. Other businesses in town took notice. The hardware store down the street started its own job training program for at-risk youth. The cafe on the corner began sourcing more products from local suppliers. A spirit of ethical business practices spread through the community. In late November, Hartley's prepared for its grand reopening as a cooperative. The store was decorated for Christmas, and a festive atmosphere filled the air. Frank stood near the entrance, greeting customers and well-wishers. He spotted Jason across the room, confidently explaining the cooperative model to a group of curious shoppers. Frank felt a surge of pride, remembering the scared young man he'd hired months ago. Sarah appeared at Frank's side. "Quite a change from last Christmas, huh?" Frank nodded. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for everything that happened. It opened my eyes to what really matters." As the day wound down, Frank gathered the staff for a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass, "and to the power of second chances." The following Christmas Eve, Frank's house was filled with warmth and laughter. Jason and Sarah sat at the dining table, along with several other Hartley's employees. The aroma of roast turkey filled the air. Frank stood to carve the bird, pausing to look around the table. His gaze lingered on the empty chair where Michael used to sit. For the first time in years, the sight didn't fill him with unbearable pain. "Before we eat," Frank said, "I'd like to say something. A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But thanks to all of you, I found a new purpose. Michael would be proud of what we've accomplished." Jason raised his glass, to Frank for giving us all a second chance. As they ate and talked, Frank felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since losing his son. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he was no longer facing them alone. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Frank stood in front of the Christmas tree. He picked up a framed photo of Michael and placed it on a branch. "Merry Christmas, son," he whispered. "I hope I'm making you proud." As snow fell gently outside, Frank reflected on the journey of the past year. From despair to hope, from suspicion to trust, from isolation to community. Hartley's had been transformed, and in the process, so had he. Frank smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to make a difference, and he was ready to face them all. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Frank's or Jason's shoes? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of redemption and second chances. Remember, it's never too late to open your heart and change a life, including your own.